Well, it's National Science Week in Australia, and that's when we celebrate all of the incredible research that's happening across the country, from astronomy to quantum physics to zoology. So, what better time to talk about AWC's large scale ecological monitoring program, which we call Ecohealth Monitoring? This is one of Australia's largest field science programs. Australian Wildlife Conservancy, as you know, has a mission that's straightforward but ambitious: effective conservation of all Australian animals and the habitats in which they live. And to achieve that, most of our staff are based in the field on our sanctuaries. They're out there dealing with the pervasive threats of feral animals and weeds and managing fire in a way that promotes biodiversity. But how can we be confident that all this work is actually making a difference? Well, like any good business, we need to measure and report on our work, not just what we're doing, but also how wildlife and ecosystems are responding. And so AWC's EcoHealth monitoring program has been developed to measure and report on the status and trends of species, ecological processes, and threats at all of our AWC sanctuaries and partnership sites. To speak about this program today, I'm joined by Dr. Holly Sidders. Thanks, Holly.
Thanks, Jerry. Great to be here.
Holly is a senior ecologist on AWC's national science team who's spent many weeks and months collating and producing our annual EcoHealth reports and scorecards, which were published this month on the AWC website. So congratulations, Holly, on production for another year of those incredible reports and scorecards. Could you start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you came to work in conservation ecology?
Sure. So once I've talked a little bit, I'm sure you'll recognize that I'm from the UK originally. And I was extremely fortunate to be able to come to Australia at the age of 14 on a family holiday. So we flew into Broome, spent about a week in Broome, traveled through the Kimberley, up to the top end, down through Central Australia, and ended up in Melbourne. So that was an incredible trip. And I was completely captivated by Australian landscapes and wildlife. And I think it was at that time that, I started to develop this dream of working in Australia in conservation. I think I was also quite strongly influenced by my dad. So he was a lawyer, but he actually left the law in his 40s to do a PhD in ornithology. And I got to go on quite a few field trips with him, mainly banding shorebirds in the UK and later in Australia, also a bit of mist netting. So I think that had a pretty strong influence on me as well.
Interesting. Our
Um,
previous guest was Dr. John Coleman, another bird bander from the UK. So there's a pattern there. I didn't realize you had that connection with bird banding. I understand some of your ecological research that you went into was focused on bushfire ecology. Tell us a bit about that work.
Yeah, that's right. So, several years, I ended up after a few visas and things like that, I ended up working at the Broome Bird Observatory. And then several years after that, I applied to do a PhD at the University of Melbourne. So, based at the Creswick campus, which is a rural campus near Ballarat. So, I came to Ballarat in 2010, and I'm still here 14 years later, which I never thought I'd be in the same place for such a long time. But there you go. It's a lovely place. Lovely place to live. And so my PhD work was focused on how we can manage fire under climate change. So, of course, we are seeing already increases in the frequency and severity of wildfires. And so, sort of trying to work out what we can do in order to mitigate those effects on birds. And so, my field work was in the Otway Ranges on Eastern Maar and Gunjip and Wathaurong country. And so, I spent a lot of time surveying birds, mist netting birds in the forest. I look back on it with rose-tinted glasses, but at the time, I mean, it was quite a lot of, bush bashing. It's very dense in some of the tall wet forest in the southwestern end of the Otway Ranges. And yeah, lots of sort of slippery tracks to drive along and that sort of thing. But overall, it was amazing to be able to spend so much time, I suppose, just observing the birds. I think, you learn a lot through just that sitting and watching,
Yeah,
certainly versus what you might learn through reading loads of papers. It's just a very different sort of knowledge, I suppose.
a
Yeah.
beautiful part of the world. And what were the sort of questions about bushfire ecology that you were seeking to answer with that work?
Yeah. So essentially, so I suppose how we can best use fire for the benefit of birds, either by, fire suppression or by applying fire. And so we essentially found that patchy plant fire doesn't have any particular effect on the bush birds that we were focusing on. And it doesn't even influence some of the ground dwelling mammals as long as it is of very low severity and quite patchy.
Mm,
But of course, a problem there is that cats and foxes will take advantage of recent fire in order to prey on the ground dwelling mammals.
mm.
So there hasn't actually been any or very much severe wildfire in the Otways for some time. So it wasn't actually possible to address all of the questions that we sort of set out to tackle,
Mm.
which is of course often the case when you're working with, lots of yeah, random variation in the environment.
Sure.
So
Yeah. Interesting stuff. And that's, aligns very closely with work that AWC has done in other parts of the country. Of course, fire is different in sort of different
yeah.
landscapes and behaves differently, it has different effects, but we're asking the same questions in parts of Northern Australia where we've led research into very similar things. Okay, fascinating background. And yeah, I think I can understand why you've been brought into the national science team as someone with that understanding of how monitoring species groups can tell us a lot. It can be really informative about how best to manage and address threats to ecosystems, which is, essentially what AWC is all about. So AWC has developed this Ecohealth monitoring program, and we'll delve into that over the course of the conversation. I just wanted to start by asking what happens when we don't have that sort of data, long-term data sets about ecosystems.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I suppose I'm partly an idealist and partly a pragmatist. And so in AWC, we have some incredible long-term data sets. For example, collected at Mornington, Marion Downs, and Tableland, we have standard live trapping data on mammals and reptiles extending back to 2004, which is just incredible. And also several of the central south sanctuaries, thanks partly to the great, great, amazing work of Keith Bell Chambers. We have very long data sets on birds, mammals, reptiles, and also the yellow-footed rock wallaby.
Mm,
So when I look at data like that, I suppose it really strongly equips us with the information that we need in order to manage those species most effectively. Um, However, of course, it's often simply not feasible to collect that sort of data on everything or anywhere close to everything. And so I think that that's where the knowledge and the observations of the staff and others who are on the ground at the sanctuaries and partnership areas is absolutely invaluable.
mm,
So if we observe an increase in fox or cat activity, and we also observe what looks like a decrease in the activity of a native mammal, specific, particularly a critical weight range mammal, between 5.5 kilograms. It seems reasonable to link those two pieces of information, even though technically, we don't have a large, robust sample size.
yeah.
So I certainly think that, particularly given the rapid rate of environmental change that we're seeing, we can't afford to just sort of sit back and wait until we've accumulated these perfect data sets before we take, proactive action.
It's a good point that, to sort of get in there and manage ecosystems, we don't necessarily need a completely comprehensive data set of how every species has tracked over time. We need a working understanding of these ecosystems and the threats and how they're operating. And I guess formalizing the data we collect through our Ecohealth program is trying to, as you said, equip us with that information, a working understanding of what we need to be doing to intervene to improve ecological health. There's this idea in business that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Do you think that applies equally to ecosystems in the same way it does to businesses?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess again, I feel sort of torn because I spent 12 years very focused on research and again, sort of trying to measure and acquire these very robust data sets such that we can address ecological research questions with some degree of confidence. But, now it's very clear that in sort of the real world, again, the pace of research is quite slow. It takes a long time to get funding, let alone get out there on the ground and actually collect the data. And so I think we have to be comfortable with the fact that we can't measure everything that we would love to measure,
Mm,
far from it. And so we can still, I believe, given there's phenomenal knowledge in the brains of so many people who are involved in AWC, that we can apply that sort of ecological common sense in order to manage species effectively, albeit while still, I guess we could consider it the gold standard to have those beautiful data sets.
Mm.
But we can still manage effectively, I think, in the process of collecting them.
So we've just published the latest round of Ecohealth reports and scorecards for sanctuaries and partnership sites. And this is looking at data from 2023 and years leading up to then. What are some of the highlights from that last 12-month reporting period?
Yeah, so it's been quite difficult for me to think of some nice examples of highlights because honestly, there are so many from 2023. So across most of the country in 2023 and in the preceding couple of years, we had good rainfall, so close to average or above average. And this has translated alongside AWC's management. It's resulted in some really positive outcomes for many species. So a lot of our focus is on the reintroduced species, of course. And so examples of those species that are doing well, at New Haven, for example, we've seen several years of good rainfall there. And the golden bandicoots, which were reintroduced at New Haven last year, are doing really well. So we've seen high survival 3 months post-release, and we're also starting to see evidence of breeding, which is really exciting. Also, the critically endangered central rock rat was reintroduced at New Haven in 2022. And again, their range is, a tiny, tiny fraction of what it was before colonization by Europeans. So they're now restricted to the ridges of Central Australia, very small range. And so to see them doing so well inside the feral predator-proof fenced area at New Haven is really exciting. And they've now been recorded about 6 kilometers from where they were originally released.
This is part of the EcoHealth report for New Haven in 2023. And just to decode the symbols there, the yellow triangles on the map, if you can see, are release sites for the central rock rat in 2022. So that's where they were originally released on Watakinpri Range. The area shown on the map is entirely within that stage 1 fenced area of 9,500 hectares. The pink circles are monitoring sites where we detected central rock rats over the past 12 months. So from those initial release sites that are clustered sort of towards the western and middle part of the range, they've now spread out across the entirety of Watakinpri Range. We only know that because we've got camera traps out at these monitoring sites collecting that data. Like you said, Holly, for something critically endangered like the central rock rat, this is fantastic to see them moving into that secure environment, making the most of all the habitat that's available to them.
It is phenomenal, isn't it? Yeah, it's just amazing to see.
Any other
Um,
highlights?
Yeah, so in terms of our threatened species that haven't been reintroduced, so extant threatened species, we call them, this is, I guess, a more cautious highlight. So the northern quoll occurs at Charnley River Artesian Range, where the cane toad unfortunately arrived about 4 years ago. And so we have limited data on northern quoll from before the cane toad's arrival, but what we do have indicates that there was, unsurprisingly, quite a to drop in abundance after the arrival of the cane toad. However, there hasn't been a further drop in abundance, and it looks like, again, several good wet seasons have sort of buffered the effect of the cane toad. And so it seems that northern quails are actually able to fare reasonably well in the very rugged terrain, such as what we see in the Artesian Range and other parts of the sort of more rugged Kimberley, relative to the more arid areas in the south and east. And so we're not 100% sure on the mechanisms for this, but it seems likely that that sort of rugged terrain provides some degree of protection against introduced predators and introduced herbivores and other threats, which I guess combined with the cane toad, have severe consequences without that protection.
Yeah, that's great because I know that's a species that many of our supporters will be familiar with. They're carnivorous marsupials that are really important ecologically across Northern Australia. That's great. That's great that quolls are hanging on.
Yeah, it is. It seems promising.
Mm.
And in terms of other, I mean, again, I've got quite a few, but the malleefowl activity of malleefowl mounds, so malleefowl being ground active birds, highly susceptible to foxes and cats. Malleefowl mound activity at Scotia has jumped right up. I think it's around about the highest level that we've seen since we started monitoring. And again, that's been a real bounce back since the drought that affected Scotia and much of Southeast Australia in
Mm.
2018 and 2019. So that's great to see. Also, an active Malleefowl mound was found at Dakalanta for the first time, and I've heard since that more have been discovered this year. So again, that's exciting to see.
Malleefowl are a really interesting one because they're across that sort of southern arid zone, and obviously, as ground nesting birds, really susceptible to interference from not just foxes, but also things like goats, which can trample the mounds and interfere with nests in that way. Um, I guess, like a lot of small mammals, really, being spending so much time close to the ground makes them especially vulnerable to feral predators. And we know historically we've seen a lot better breeding success, nesting success inside those fenced predator-free safe havens. So Scotia, Yucumara, Mallee Cliffs, and Mount Gibson. But predators is just one of the threats. So any bad news on malleefowl from other parts of the country?
Yes, unfortunately. So I suppose, yeah, in general, we saw great conditions across a lot of the country last year, or at least sort of around about average.
Mm,
But a major exception was southwest and central Western Australia, where rainfall was extremely low. And so the activity of malleefowl has been monitored at Mount Gibson Wildlife Sanctuary since 2010. And last year was the first year where there was no activity at any of the mounds because total rainfall was only 147 millimeters. Um, and so while this is sort of confronting to see, it actually isn't unusual in the context of the responses of malleefowl to very dry conditions elsewhere. So as I mentioned at Scotia during the drought of 2018, 2019, we saw the same sort of thing. So it seems that, yeah, malleefowl respond very quickly to changes in condition. And we would hope and assume, I suppose, that as long as we continue our practice of managing threats, that the birds will become more active and we'll see more breeding once rainfall increases again.
mm. Yeah, I guess this sort of surveillance monitoring also allows us to focus our attention on species like that when we understand that something might be more vulnerable than other things to changing conditions. We can either ramp up monitoring, so targeted monitoring of threatened species, or even invite in, research to answer a particular question about how a threat operates or how a species is responding to conditions. So the idea of surveillance monitoring is really important in that sense. So there's some lovely examples and great points about how the data we're collecting is actually telling us something meaningful about how species respond to different things in different parts of the country. But ecosystems are so complex and there are so many different components we could choose to measure. What sort of decision making goes into choosing which metrics are most relevant from a conservation point of view? How do we make those decisions and decide where to focus our resources?
Yep. So the reintroduced species are always afforded the highest priority because, of course, AWC has a high responsibility to ensure that those are successful. And so reintroduced species are monitored particularly intensively during the first few months after the translocation. So an example there is the northern bettong at Mount Zero Taravale, reintroduced last year. And yeah, results showing that survival is really high, which is, yeah, great to see. And so as we move into the maintenance phase, we'll sort of pull back on the monitoring of reintroduced species with the aim of calculating a population estimate every year. And of course, there is a degree of flexibility. So for example, at Mount Gibson, and 4A monitoring is undertaken more frequently at the moment because of those dry conditions. Um, so then, of course, the nationally threatened species are the sort of the next highest priority, but they're not all treated equally. So where a large proportion of the species' global distribution overlaps with an AWC sanctuary, we afford that species, top priority. And an example there is the Sharman's rock wallaby. 70% of its distribution, roughly, overlaps with Mount Zero Taravale Wildlife Sanctuary. So again, high responsibility on AWC for the conservation of the species as a whole.
Mm.
And then at the other end of the spectrum, we might have a species like the southern whiteface. So this is a sort of a thornbill-like stocky little bush bird that has a very broad distribution across southern and central Australia. It was listed as vulnerable last year. And so while we do monitor it at several sanctuaries, because only a tiny proportion of its distribution overlaps with our sanctuaries, we don't afford it such a high priority.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. So it is threatened, but
Yeah,
AWC's contribution to its conservation is sort of relatively limited, I guess, because of its wide-ranging but vulnerable to threats beyond just, things that are happening on our
yeah,
sanctuaries, right? Yeah.
yeah, that's right. Yep. And so then we have, yeah, the other species, I guess. And again, focusing on the vertebrates generally.
Mm,
Certainly not that we don't think invertebrates are important. Of course, they are critically important. It's really just a matter of having to prioritize our resources and
mm,
our energy. And so we do focus on the vertebrates. And so we monitor birds, mammals, reptiles, and frogs less frequently than those threatened species, but
mm,
still, again, as I mentioned, we've got some fantastic, robust, standardized long-term data on those species, which can be extremely informative, and it can allow us to tackle those questions like, how does the effect of fire depend on annual rainfall?
mm,
How does the effect of fire depend on the presence of cattle? That sort of thing. So yeah, incredibly rich data sets
mm.
that allow us to go beyond just that sort of how is the animal tracking from one year to the next.
But I'm just preempting some of the questions we might get. And I know you mentioned invertebrates as something that, yeah, we would love to get more information about how they're faring across the sites where we work. But in terms of collecting that data, it's just a whole other level of resourcing that currently we're not able to measure everything at every site. What about plants and vegetation? Is that incorporated into the Ecohealth program?
It is, yeah. So I suppose, and again, it's partly because there are just relatively few ecologists who have that plant ID knowledge in the country. And so we have on the national science team two incredible vegetation ecologists who spend almost all their time in the field in different sanctuaries around the country collecting those data. And so while, we have a way to go in terms of catching up to the level of data that we have on the animals,
Mm,
we do certainly report on um, flora, particularly the threatened flora, which
yeah.
overlap our sanctuaries. So this same sort of philosophy, I guess, that we use to prioritize the animals.
Mm. My understanding is that at fenced sites, so where we've got some of these fenced safe havens and reintroduction projects, typically we've set up a system of permanent vegetation monitoring sites where they're matched. So there's one inside, one outside in equivalent habitat, and there'll be multiples of those for each habitat type. And I guess the benefit with vegetation is, it's not running away anywhere. So you can get sort of longer intervals between collecting that data and still say something meaningful about how that the reintroduction project or how the reintroduced animals might be changing some of the vegetation dynamics. You don't need to be measuring that every year. You can maybe go back after 3 or 5 years and still say something meaningful about how vegetation has changed. So beyond sort of particular species being targeted, there's also broad surveillance monitoring, what we term surveillance monitoring, and that's looking at rather than sort of species level assemblages or guilds, so whole groups of animals that either occupy a particular lifestyle or habitat. How is that sort of data measured and how is it useful to us?
Yep. So I suppose I'll use birds as an example
Sure.
because I guess that's where, yeah, I've spent a lot of time focused on. So I had the privilege of getting to work with the Buckaringa bird data set collected by Keith Bell Chambers and his team since 2009. And so out of that data, we start, I suppose, with the richness of diurnal birds. We also have the reporting rate, which is similar to abundance. And then we focus on the woodland bird guild, the ground active bird guild, and the honeyeater guild. And so we focus on those guilds because we expect them to respond to changes in resource availability at the sanctuary. And so just using the results from 2023 as an example, um, The results for all of the guilds and diurnal birds of a whole were within the healthy range of what we would expect to see based on recent rainfall. Um, so we've recently developed a new method of, I suppose, objectively assigning a sort of a status to our metrics. And so based on this method, which takes into account recent rainfall, because of course we may see a really high value and think, oh, that's fantastic. But it is
Mm.
because of recent rainfall, and then if rainfall decreases, it may drop right down. And
Right.
so it's important to be able to distinguish the effects of rainfall on what we're measuring from the effects of things that we're better able to manage,
Mm.
all the threats that we've been talking about. Um, so yeah, for the guilds at Buckaringa in 2023, things were looking good again, in part because of the management that we're doing on the ground, and in part because of the recent good conditions.
Mm. Yeah, so disentangling the what's driving those trends, I guess that I mean this work is infinite, isn't it? When you've got the rich data set, you can ask all sorts of questions about why you're seeing particular patterns in particular places. I guess is there scope also for external researchers to come in and access the data that we're producing, and does much of that happen?
Yeah, a huge amount actually happens. I can't tell you off the top of my head how many active external research projects we have at the moment, but it's a would be above 50, probably could be closer to 100, but there are certainly many addressing a wide range of topics. So just as an example, for example, we've got people using environmental DNA, looking at the potential for environmental DNA, I suppose, to um, yeah, allow us to survey many of those groups which we currently don't have the capacity to do, like the invertebrates, the fungi. There are many groups that we're not able to cover.
Mm.
Certainly, with high resolution.
Mm.
And so a lot of the research that is undertaken sort of in partnership with AWC, it feeds back into what we're doing and helps inform the monitoring that we're doing. So yeah, those new technology I think are super exciting. There is just so much potential
Mm.
there in allowing us to expand our scope to those sort of wish list
Yeah.
taxonomic groups.
Fantastic. I'm just thinking about sort of the process of collating all of this data. Well, collecting the data first. We've got this team of scientists out there in the field working very closely with our land management and operations teams to set traps, to measure skinks, to count scales, to weigh native rodents. All of that information, it's such a lot of data. Can you just give us a reflection on sort of the effort that goes into collecting all of that? And then at your end, in sort of processing and collating that data into something that's meaningful and consistent across different regions and different sanctuaries, it's a mammoth effort.
It really is. I mean, I kind of find it difficult to put into words. I mean, I come into this whole process at the tail end, I'm the one who gets to see the neatly put together reports, and I'll sort of go through and review them and tweak a few things and that sort of thing. But the amount of work that is put into just one of these reports is absolutely phenomenal. And we have more than 20. So we focus these reports on the sanctuaries for which the inventory phase of data collection is complete. So we don't have a report for every single sanctuary every year, but there's still a very large number. And so, yeah, the sheer volume of work that goes into selecting the sites, putting out the traps, visiting the traps, and then, inputting the data and reshaping the data and getting a nice metric out of the data, then plotting it, making it look pretty and interpreting it. Yeah, there's an absolutely huge number of people that have put a phenomenal amount of work into these reports. And yeah, now it's sort of, I don't know, it's amazing to be able to just step back and look at them as a body of work, I suppose. And yeah, pull out some of these key trends and things. It's just really exciting. And yeah, I feel like a bit of an imposter because I do get to just jump in at the end and talk about it and wax lyrical. Um, and yeah, so many people have obviously got their, boots on the ground and just working around the clock to
Holly,
create
you're
this.
not an imposter at all. Obviously, it's a team effort, but the national science team plays such an important role in bringing this data together and making sense of it in a way that we can share more broadly. Speaking of, if anyone viewing is interested in looking at our most recent Ecohealth reports, I'll share a link in the chat shortly, but you can also go to australianwildlife.org and look for our Ecohealth reports and scorecards there. We've also collated some of the highlights into our annual impact report. So you can read all about what's been happening at AWC over the past 12 months and some of the incredible wins that we've had for conservation of Australian wildlife. Holly, this is really impressive. And on National Science Week, congratulations to you and your team for making such a great contribution to our understanding of these ecosystems where we work.
Thanks so much, Joey. Great to talk to you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You can read more about our Ecohealth monitoring program at our website, australianwildlife.org. If you've been inspired by this conversation and the work that AWC is doing, please consider making a donation. Also, that's at australianwildlife.org. You can give us a call, send us an email, or go to our website to help us save Australia's threatened wildlife from extinction.